Welcome. My name is Holly. I'm a program manager at Edison Ford Winter Estates, and thank you for joining us on this webinar. It's about the life and legacy of Helen Keller. I'm very thankful you're here, and I'm going to share my screen with you. And first, I guess I should just make a little disclaimer here in that Helen Keller was one of my childhood heroes, somebody I read a lot about growing up. And also my mother worked as a volunteer at a mission in California for the deaf and the deafblind. So I have that interest as well. Let me get started though and share my screen with you. Helen Keller's life and legacy. And this is Helen with her teacher, Anne Sullivan. Just wanted to start off with a quote by Helen. And the best and most beautiful things in the world cannot be seen or even touched. They must be felt with the heart. And my goal is to kind of show you all sides of Helen. She was a flesh and blood person. I think she got elevated and people forgot that she had feelings and thoughts and desires of her own. And of course, in being human, she had mistakes along like any of us do. Helen Keller was born in Tuscumbia, Alabama. Oh, and by the way, I'm in front of her home, Ivy Green in Tuscumbia. She was the oldest of three children who were born to Arthur H. Keller and Catherine Adams Keller. She also had two older half-brothers, and Helen's father had been an officer in the Confederate Army during the Civil War. The family was not wealthy and earned money from their cotton plantation, and later on, Arthur became the editor of a weekly local newspaper, the North Alabamian. But I will tell you that they always struggled for money, and that was a big issue for them. And over here, you can see Ivy Green. That's their home. It's open to the public to visit today. I would go to their website to check it out. But right here is over on the side is actually the little cottage where she was born. And I'll just say quite briefly, because I didn't put this on the slide, that her parents married. He was about 20 years older. He had lost his first wife. The oldest son had a hard time having a stepmother near his own age. The younger son, not so much. And there was money struggles. She was from an affluent family up north. And it just was never, it seemed to be a happy marriage. And I do believe that Captain Keller was a little controlling. But that's my opinion, just based on what I've read. When Helen was 19 months, she became sick, what is now believed to either be scarlet fever or meningitis, or it could have been something else. The doctors diagnosed her with acute congestion of the stomach and brain. That's interesting. Thomas Edison's first wife was said to have died from congestion of the brain. So I think that's what they put out there when they don't really know. Helen lost her vision and her hearing. As Helen grew older, she developed a limited method of communication with her companion, Martha Washington, the daughter of the family cook. They had created a type of sign language that's rather rough, but by the time Keller was 7, they had invented more than 60 signs to communicate with each other. And during this time, her behavior became out of control. She would kick and scream when she was angry and laugh when happy. She tormented Martha and had violent tantrums for her parents, and many of her relatives thought she should be institutionalized. Searching for answers, Helen's mother read an article by Charles Dickens, American Notes, in 1886. She read about the education of a deaf and blind child, Laura Bridgman, who actually was from New Hampshire, by the way, and sent Helen and her father to Baltimore, Maryland to see Dr. J. Julian Chisholm. After examining Helen, Dr. Chisholm recommended that she meet Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, who was working with deaf children. Bell met with Keller and her parents and recommended that they write to the Perkins Institute for the Blind in Boston, Massachusetts, where Laura Bridgman lived. The director wrote back with the name of a teacher for Helen, Anne Sullivan. And that's Helen with Alexander Graham Bell. And again, at one point, he was a revered figure, but I will have to say that some of his methods today might be questioned. He had a deaf mother and he had a deaf wife, and he did not want them to use sign language. He wanted them to be able to speak clearly, and so much so that, that nobody would perhaps even know that they were deaf. And I said sign language, American Sign Language itself is a language, and that this is just my opinion, but I will throw it in there that if you are deaf, it's up to you how you communicate with others. Nobody else should dictate that. But Helen revered Alexander Graham Bell, I will tell you that. And he did get her pointed in the direction of her teacher. So I definitely understand that. And there's Anne Sullivan right there. Anne Sullivan was born into poverty. This isn't a presentation on her, but I would encourage you to look up her life story. It was pretty difficult. She contracted trachoma, which is a disease of the eye, when she was 5. And I've read that that was like a severe form of conjunctivitis that created growths on the eye, among other things. 3 years later, her mother died of tuberculosis and was buried in Potter's Field because they had no money to bury her, after which her father, an alcoholic, prone to beating his children, deserted the family. Annie was now tossed into the poorhouse in Tewksbury, Massachusetts, among syphilitic prostitutes and madmen. It was a horrible place. I'll read some more in a minute, but I'll tell you that some of her companions were rats, and of course, some of the people there. It was no place that a child should ever been put in, nor should it ever have been open. Decades later, recalling its strange grotesqueness and even terribleness, Annie Sullivan wrote, "I doubt life, or for that matter, the eternity, is long enough to erase the terrors and ugly blots scored upon my mind during those dismal years from 8 to 14. And by the way, her brother Jimmy was there too. And I guess I didn't put that in there, but her brother Jimmy was not well. I think he had what they called a tubercular hip. He died there. And Jimmy and Annie were very close. She had a younger sibling that was raised by a family member. The rest of them were just tossed to this madness. But it was a devastating time for her when she lost her brother, and she was rescued from there by a committee investigating its horrors and was transferred to Perkins Institute for the Blind. She learned Braille and the manual alphabet, and the manual alphabet is a way of finger spelling with your hands the letters of the alphabet, and each motion of the hand represents a letter of the alphabet. And I can finger spell but not remember much sign language, but that would be the letter A there, B, and so on. At the Massachusetts Eye and Ear Infirmary, she underwent 2 operations which allowed her to read almost normally, though her eyes remained fragile, and she would have eye disease through and problems with her vision throughout her life. After 6 years, she graduated from Perkins as class valedictorian. But what would happen to her? How was she going to earn a living? Someone suggested she might wash dishes or peddle needlework. I love this quote. "Sewing and crocheting are inventions of the devil," she said. "I'd rather break stones on the King's Highway than hem a handkerchief." She went to Tuscumbia instead, sent by the director of Perkins, Michael Anagnos. I butchered that, I apologize. She was 20 years old and had no experience suitable for what she was about to encounter in the despairs and the chaoticness of the Keller household. And for some reason, he thought she was the person. She had no teaching background. And she also frequently had a short temper. She had been through a lot. She had mood swings as well. The child she had come to educate through silverware pinched, grabbed food off plate. She grabbed food off plate, set chairs flying, shrieked, struggled. She was out of control. Annie decided to do this. She began with methods used by the first director of Perkins, Samuel Gridley Howe. Though some people challenged that if she just came up with them on her own. And by the way, the director that sent her, he was the son-in-law of Samuel Gridley Howe when he worked with Laura Bridgman 50 years before. She fingerspelled the name of familiar objects into Helen's hand. So realize that is me distinguishing each motion in her hand. So that is what they did with her, the manual alphabet, not complete sign language because of her vision and hearing loss. She innovated by using Keller's favorite activities and her love of nature into the lessons. Keller enjoyed this, but she didn't comprehend until the moment when Sullivan spelled water, W-A-T-E-R. She fingerspelled each letter while pumping water over her hand. Keller later wrote, "Suddenly I felt a misty consciousness as of something forgotten, a thrill of returning thought, and somehow the mystery of language was revealed to me in that moment. I knew then that W-A-T-E-R, each letter being spelled into her hand, meant the wonderful, cool something that was flowing over my hand. That living word awakened my soul, gave it light, hope, joy, set it free." Realize this wasn't easy. And actually, on the first day that Helen and Annie are introduced, Helen knocks out her teacher's front tooth. So it's a good thing that Annie was a determined, stubborn woman, was determined to make this work. Everything had a name, and each name gave birth to a new thought. I'm quoting Helen here. As we returned to the house, every object which I touched seemed to quiver with life. And that is an excerpt from The Story of My Life by Helen Keller. Can you imagine how different her life could have been if Anne Sullivan had not come into her life? And there are Helen and Anne. In 1890, Helen began speech classes at the Horace Mann School for the Deaf in Boston. She worked for, that should say 2.5 years, not 25 years, to learn to speak so others could understand her. One of the things I read, and that was a goal for her and for her teacher, which today might not have ever happened. But there are also different methods, of course, of teaching someone to speak that has had a hearing loss. And I think Annie and Helen did what they had with the information they had. But there are people that are able to speak more clearly than Helen did. Some people had a very hard time to understand her. But again, is that a worthwhile goal for her to even have? From 1894 to 1896, Helen attended the Wright Humanson School for the Deaf in New York City. There she worked on improving her communication skills and study academics. Now, this was a very turbulent time because the director of the school felt like that Helen was getting nervous exhaustion and that she was ready to have a breakdown, and that this was just all too much. And the director of the Wright Humanson School convinced Mrs. Keller to appoint him Helen's guardian. So there were a lot of back and forth and changes going on at the time. Helen wants to go so she's going to do that. Oh, yes. And by the way, in the meantime, Captain Keller dies. He's not necessarily very fond of Anne. Anne is very much a more liberal thinker than he is. He is somebody that still believes in having, not that far removed from slavery, had been a Confederate captain during the Civil War. So there are all these back and forths between Anne and Captain Keller, and then Anne and both the parents. But Captain Keller had passed away. Mrs. Keller got a letter from the director of that Wright Humanson School, and basically he was saying, appoint me Helen's guardian now, not Anne Sullivan. She's not up to the task. She's exhausting Helen. But this is also an age when they think that women are frail creatures. If you are having your menstrual cycle, you need to go to bed. You've got too nervous energy. Women shouldn't be doing this. So there was a lot of back and forth. And eventually it worked out that Anne remained Helen's guardian. But Helen became determined to attend college. In 1896, she attended the Cambridge School for Young Women, a prep school. And that's actually the school I should have said. The Wright Humanson one was where she's working on her communication skills. Cambridge Schools for Young Ladies, the prep school, is where this thing goes back and forth between the school and Anne Sullivan. I apologize, I jumped ahead a line. And tried to get Mrs. Keller to agree that this gentleman should be her guardian, which does happen, but then it's taken back, and they leave the Cambridge school because Helen is so upset and Annie is so upset. They wanted to be with each other, and the Cambridge school gentleman felt like that Annie was overworking Helen. Everything else is true. I just mixed up the names there. As her story became better known to the public, Keller began to meet famous and powerful people. One of them was the author, Mark Twain, who was impressed with her. They become very good friends. And Mark introduced her to his friend, Henry Rogers, a Standard Oil executive. And we know Mark Twain, his real name was Samuel Clemens. There's Samuel Clemens, Annie, and Helen. And up here you can, this is an unknown gentleman, and up here you can see Annie finger spelling into Helen's hand. And she and Mark Twain kept up a correspondence and met with each other several times. And Rogers, that Standard Oil executive, was so impressed with Helen that he agreed to pay for her to attend Radcliffe College. She actually had wanted to attend Harvard, but at that time women were not allowed, and eventually Radcliffe will become part of Harvard. But at the time, that was the most that was open to her as a female. She was joined by Anne, who sat by her to interpret lectures. Helen had mastered several methods of communication, including touch lip reading, and there's more than one way to do that, which Helen would feel the person's face, feel their lips to know what they were saying. Braille, but back then they didn't have those braillers, so it would have had to have been something that was done ahead of time. Speech, typing, and finger spelling. It wasn't easy. Annie was there by her side. And so, I mean, she's got this thing that's not going to, she tries interacting with students. She also has to work extra hard, put in extra time because of Annie having to interpret for her and communicate in that way. And what I lost my train of thought here, but what I was going to say was that it wasn't easy. She's always got Annie with her. Does she get to meet other students? Not readily or easily. But she is at Radcliffe. This is happening. And she graduates cum laude with honors. She actually wanted it to be summa cum laude, I believe. She was disappointed. But she graduates when she's 24. The honor belonged to Anne and Helen. Anne's eyes suffered from reading everything that she then signed into Helen's hand, and also during class lectures that had to happen. And Anne continued by her students' side until her death in 1936. While at the Perkins School for the Blind, Helen was introduced to John Hitz, the superintendent of Alexander Graham Bell's Volta Bureau, a person with whom she developed a deep friendship that lasted until his death 16 years later. And she remembered she knew Alexander Graham Bell, and he is superintendent of this institution that Bell develops for the deaf. But he also many times is listed as Alexander Graham Bell's secretary. And she developed this deep friendship that lasted till his death 16 years later. And she calls him, and I probably shouldn't put this in here. Obviously, I don't speak Swedish, but Flegervater, or foster father of my soul. And he called her, and I'm going to mess this up, mine, Ingaste Galid Toucher Helene, or my deeply beloved daughter Helen. Helen Keller's spiritual site, Swedenborg Foundation. John Hitz was the person who brought Emanuel Swedenborg and his religious teachings to Helen's attention, giving her a copy of his book, Heaven and Hell, when she was 14, and she becomes a devout follower for the rest of his life. And looking this up today, it's still in existence as a religious system, but not to the degree that it was then, and not to the degree that she ever left it. Anne, however, was an atheist, primarily, I believe, due to her experiences as a young child. You can find things on Swedenborgism, and it is certainly a faith in God, but it also seems to have some elements of mysticism in it as well today. So you might want to check that out. And here's what I did yesterday. I met somebody from Sweden, and I thought, I'll ask him about Swedenborgism, but he had never heard of it, and he was traveling here. So it's not as well known today, but I would encourage you to look it up because it becomes the religious practice that Helen follows thanks to John Hitz. And that's actually Bell there. In 1905, her teacher Anne married John Macy, an instructor at Harvard University, and he was a prominent socialist. After marriage, she continued to be Helen's guide and mentor. When Helen went to live with them, they both initially gave their undivided attention to her. However, Anne and John eventually became distant to each other as Helen's devotion to Keller was always first. I think John knew that. He's quite about 12 years younger than her, I believe, than Anne. And after several years, the couple separated, though they never divorced. With the help of both Sullivan and Macy, Keller wrote her first book that came out when she's 21 years old, and that's called The Story of My Life. And I have read that as a child. It was published in 1903. And the memoir covered Keller's life from childhood to 21-year-old college student. It's still in print today and is in 50 different languages. And the first home that they have once she graduates from Radcliffe beyond Alabama was she lived at Rentham, Massachusetts. And eventually she will move to Boston. They do have a fire at home where a lot of the letters between Helen and Anne and John, they disappear. And you're probably wondering how Helen actually, she writes by using like a square board, and her handwriting is very square, but very easy to read as well. And that kept it in a very orderly fashion. And today, again, with Braille, because she does so much work with the blind, there's a machine where you can type on one end and it comes out in Braille on the other, which would have opened up so many more opportunities for communication with Helen, in addition to the finger spelling and the other methods she used. So I want you to imagine that there's a woman, I mean, they're closer in age here. John does introduce Helen also to some socialism, though she had some leanings before that. She was a very well-read young woman. And also, Anne at one point has to have surgery, and she does gain quite a deal of weight, and that's very upsetting to her. And she, as most people attribute it to her having a hysterectomy. So that's upsetting to her. Her husband, there was just a lot of back and forth between her and John, even though he always knew that Helen would be part of the picture. It grew old. He starts drinking. They do separate, and apparently he becomes involved with a deaf woman, but they never marry. And Anne is always in Helen's life, and I think she always still loved John, but we'll get back to that later. And there's John fingerspelling with Helen. But I also want to mention that even though it may seem like it was a detriment, which it certainly would be for a couple's relationship to always have someone there, Helen is the person that brings in the money mostly that they all depend on for the household. So keep that in the back of your mind as well. That's one of my favorite pictures of Helen. And she had still had the sense of touch and taste. I think Laura Bridgman, I think she only had, and smell. I think Laura Bridgman, the person I talked about earlier, I had one sense left. Well, she publishes 14 books, including some about her personal experiences, one on religion, and you know what her religion is, one on contemporary social problems, and a biography of Anne Sullivan called Teacher. She compiled nearly 500 essays and speeches on a variety of topics. A brilliant young woman. She wrote many articles for the national magazines on the prevention of blindness and the education and special problems of the blind. And this is a letter, and I think I promised that I originally had it in a separate section, but I kind of interspersed the connections with Edison and Ford. and Helen Keller. So this is a letter from her, Mina, Thomas Edison's second wife, to her son, Charles. And I think the date was, 1913. My darling Charles, we have just had a wonderful day and feel exhausted after it. Helen Keller came out from New York on the 2:46 p.m. and remained with us until the time to take the 5:52 from Newark. She had to be in Cleveland tomorrow. To watch her was most interesting, and to hear the comments, questions, and answers made by the teacher and Miss Keller and Papa, respectively, was something not to be forgotten. Remember, Edison has severe hearing loss as well. It was an absorbing and intense afternoon. I wish you might have been here. You were in our thoughts. Papa wanted to try the experiment inside a silk hat, and yours was the one used. I don't know what that was, but I sure wish I did. And after I used it, her teacher said that it was, well, that the answer of the hat was in the owner of the hat was in California, which was Charles. What a strange life some people must lead. This teacher is married. She was separated, I'm pretty sure, by 1914. So it will be coming up soon. Yet she is going with Helen Keller on a lecture tour to be given until May. I should simply die if I had to do such things. So you get an idea of Mina's thoughts about Helen. And yes, they go on a lecture tour. And I believe, if I remember correctly, Helen would speak out loud, and Anne would have to repeat a lot of the time so that people could understand it. And trust me, I have nothing of the greatest admiration for Helen and her desire to do what she wanted to do, which at that time it was believed to be the best thing, to be able to speak out loud. But remember, they also used that finger spelling, the manual alphabet. In 1916, when she was about 36 years of age, she was preparing to elope with a young writer and secretary, Peter Fagan. I believe at that point, Anne was not well health-wise. She was away. Another person, Polly, that had come to help them wasn't available. She was with Anne. And so this young man that they knew from Harvard, Peter Fagan, and became her secretary. And Helen and he had fallen in love. And Fagan had learned the manual alphabet and Braille to be able to interpret for Helen. Helen's mother, Kate Keller, prevented the elopement. There was a belief during this time that if you had a disability, you should not be allowed to marry and have children. Keller wrote the following: what earthly consolation is there for one like me, whom fate has denied a husband and the joy of motherhood? At the moment of my loneliness seems a void that will always be immense. Fortunately, I have much work to do, more than ever, in fact. And they were going to run away. It got found out. She was in Alabama. I believe or at her sister's home, and he showed up, and her brother-in-law had a shotgun. This man was determined. I believe he was really in love, and she was in love, but Helen only went so far in challenging it. It's a very sad thing to me that she was deprived of this ability. I feel like if it had been in this time period, that thoughts might have been different. Helen intellectually had no issues, and because of the loss of her hearing and vision, felt like she was not supposed to marry. And I believe Anne Sullivan might have believed that somewhat as well. Definitely her mother and her family did, for sure. So many more things that are out there now that people can use for interpretation. And I believe she would have been able to have this romance. And my heart always breaks reading about this and hearing about it. And this is Helen's letter to John Macy about visiting Thomas Edison. And I'll read this. It was interpreted. This is on American Foundation of Blindness website, and they interpret it sometimes. There's a few little grammatical errors. Remember, Helen is writing this in square hand, and then it's interpreted by some of the people that are at that foundation, some volunteers. We are full of our delightful visit to Mr. Edison. What a wonderful experience. And I actually think that it's dated 1914, but I think this is actually the visit that is listed on the Edison papers records, the same visit, which was 1913. So I'm not sure if it's 13 or 14, but here we go. It was a wonderful experience for me to meet the man whose brain flashed forth the thought that turned day into night into day, excuse me. We also met his wife and daughter, Mr. Hutchinson, the one who tested my hearing years ago in Cambridge. And he's somebody that will work with Edison and interpret for him tapping a Morse code when he was having meetings of the Naval Consulting Board. Mr. Edison is very deaf, you know, and he couldn't, and you'll see some SIC, meaning grammatical or spelling issue, understand me. He said my vowels were all right, but he couldn't get my consonants. How I wish I could have someone like him to hear me every day. Then I am sure I should catch that baffling, heartbreaking, brain-racking will-o'-wisp of natural speech. I sat by Mr. Edison and read his lips as he talked to me. So she put her hands on his lips about his inventions. He expects soon to perfect a machine that will produce speaking pictures. We know he starts with silent films, but he never did speaking films. And then the motion picture industry, by the way, moves to Hollywood, and that was the end of his time in that. He told me that it would be possible for me to lecture all over the country in this way while I slept. How comfortable that sounds. I asked him if he thought something could be invented that would enable the blind to read ink print books, and he said, yes, I do, which there's talking books, of course, today. He tried it once. I begged him to keep on, and he said he would. He showed me his marvelous phonograph, and for a few minutes, I tried to feel the music by placing my hand on the instrument, but there were so many voices inside struggling to be heard that I must listen hard to get any vibration. Then Mr. Edison put a hat in my hand. Remember that story in which I held before the instrument? That's the story Mina was talking about. And lo, my fingers were thrilled with the sweetest strains, full, rich, and varied. And she often listens to music through the vibrations, but this is a different way of feeling the vibrations. Someone else wanted me to try his hat for the same purpose, and I found it still more musical. I had good fun with it. By the way of experiment, I laid my cheek against it and then touched it with my lips and put it up to my forehead. All the time, I felt merry laughter in the hat. I knew that the others were joking, and I suspected whose hat it was, Mr. Hutchinson, the second hat. I asked Mr. Edison what kind of wood I might use with advantage to observe my speech when I practice, and he said he would have something arranged for me. He also invited us to spend a day in the laboratory next May and declared that something must come of it. A day at Mr. Edison's laboratory, which I hear is guaranteed guarded by detectives. Can you believe it? I feel as though I had but dreamed it. And yet teacher gives her testimony that our wizard of light and sound wishes me to enter that sanctum sanctorum and have a glimpse of the secrets of his glorious art. You may be sure that will interest me vastly more than all that I saw at the physical laboratory in Washington. I have loved him for a long time because of his tireless patience and enthusiasm in the service of humanity. And now I know of him as one of the dearest, kindest men I have ever met. Not everybody refers to Mr. Edison that way. Before we left, Mrs. Edison gave us some wonderful lilies of the valley and arbor vitae carnations, which made me think of those I smell in dreams. Of course, I was only thinking of the king and didn't notice the place. But teacher said his home is very beautiful. I am indeed fortunate. In less than a week, I have seen and talked face to face with two great benefactors of men, Dr. Montessori, and that's a different Montessori than Maria Montessori, the early childhood ed expert, and Mr. Edison. Their interests differ widely, it is true, but they labor with equal fervor to give us our true kingdom in the senses. Letter from Helen Keller to John Macy about visiting with Thomas Edison, 12/15/1913 or 14. And I do believe they had contact later on. If I had dug and kept digging, it wasn't easy to find. I might have found more. So I just thought I loved that reflection. Of course, it ties into our story here. And I thought you'd enjoy this picture. This is either, and it's labeled I saw it in a couple different places, either 1914 or 1916, and she had met Henry Ford, and she is reading his lips on his face there. And they also had a friendship, though I don't believe it was to the depth of Edison. But I love that picture, and that's Anne Sullivan there behind them. Helen made many appearances on the lecture circuit, and here's the story. And in 1918, made a movie in Hollywood, Deliverance, and this was a silent film to dramatize the plight of the blind. Together with her lifelong friend, companion, and beloved instructor, Anne Sullivan Macy, both appearing personally in the most interesting and comparable, I can't read that last word, but that you get the idea, from her triumphant tour on America's best theaters. During the next 2 years, she supported herself and Sullivan on the vaudeville stage. And I kind of told you how I remember. I didn't actually see that in writing this time, but I remember it from the many books I read about her, that I believe that's how that was done. Helen identified herself, and there's Helen with teacher Anne Sullivan. She always called her teacher, by the way, as a socialist politically. And Anne Sullivan was not, but Anne Sullivan Macy was not, but John Macy was. Helen was an early supporter of the NAACP and an opponent of lynchings that had been taking place during this time. She was an early proponent of birth control. She advocated for workers' rights and women's suffrage. She was a founding member of the American Civil Liberties Union and the American Foundation for the Blind. It was with the American Foundation for the Blind that Helen achieved a national and global level of influence for the blind and visually impaired. She was responsible for the rehabilitation centers being established and education being made available for the vision impaired through the U.S. She visited soldiers who returned injured from World War II and formed an organization to assist deaf-blind people in the U.S. In 1915, she served on the first board of directors for the Permanent Blind War Relief Fund, later renamed the American Braille Press, then the American Foundation for Overseas Blind. The organization is now known as Helen Keller International, and Helen was named a counselor on the international relations by the American Foundation of the Blind in 1946 and began to tour the globe for the vision impaired. And she works a lot with the blind and deaf blind, not as much with the deaf, though she certainly communicated with them. And be upfront, there's a brief time when she was a brief supporter of eugenics, which seemed rather ironic, as some people would have thought that she shouldn't have been there, but she quickly changed her views. Eugenics meaning that people that had disabilities and handicaps, maybe they should not be born, or so on. But that was a very brief flirtation. And remember, Helen is very well read, but also communication with the outside world beyond books is dependent on whoever is signing into her hand. Giving the manual alphabet, excuse me, shouldn't say signing. Telegram from Helen Keller to Thomas Edison wishing him a happy birthday, October 21st, 1929. And this is from the American Foundation for the Blind, and this was the opening of the Edison Institute, which is now called part of the Henry Ford, or it's doing business as the Henry Ford. And there's no pictures of Helen Keller and Thomas Edison together, which is disappointing. And that's in his Menlo Park, New Jersey lab. You'll know why I picked this picture in a little bit. That's Edison Ford. It was moved there to Greenfield Village, the opening of the Edison Institute. That's today the Henry Ford. And there's Francis Yale, who also was with Edison, who was working on the light bulb there. But Helen couldn't be there, so she sends him a telegram. Dear Mr. Edison, there are two lights, one ruling the sky and the other the mind. With the thousand eyes of the mind, I can see and rejoice in the miracle you have wrought. You looked at our world and saw that the moon and star candles God had set in the firmament were not sufficient to light great cities, and you made the incandescent lamp, and lo, the night grew day. God bless you and keep you. May the years that remain to you be as a looking glass, reflecting the million grateful faces of mankind. Sincerely yours, Helen Keller. And I love that. That shows how her heart felt towards Edison, and that was from the American Foundation of the Blind's website. And here, 1930, 1 year later, Helen is in Edison's Menlo Park lab that was in Greenfield Village, sitting there. I believe that's the chair that was nailed down, that nobody is allowed to touch except her, apparently. And by the way, you can see his lab from Fort Myers there as well. So she obviously had been in contact with Henry Ford to be there. And by the way, during World War I, Ford asked her to go on the peace ship, and she certainly was opposed to World War I. She was a pacifist, but she did not go on the peace ship. I'm not quite sure why. That was kind of a failed venture. We used to have this picture in the museum when I started, and it was under a section called Family and Friends. And it said, and this quote was by it, something at some point she must have written to Edison: "Not loudness, but love sounds in your ear, my friend." And the sentimentality and the love for Edison comes through. I haven't run across, besides his, family, I have not run across that as much. And certainly Edison, in my opinion, wasn't known as that much of a sentimental man, but something must have struck a chord in him and Helen Keller. But I remember this picture. The exhibit isn't up anymore, but I really I loved it. And I loved that quote. So I wanted to share it with you. And this is from the Henry Ford Explore Research Roads from Clara Ford to Henry Ford to Helen Keller. And so there she is in 1930 on the porch of the Menlo Park lab. There's Francis Yale. You saw him in the other picture. There's Edsel Ford. There is Helen Keller. And by this, and Anne Sullivan, I'm guessing, wasn't in good enough health. There's Helen, and there is Polly Thompson, who became her their secretary and then will become Helen's companion. And both Edsel and Clara sent money to different organizations, things that causes that Helen supported. I wasn't able to determine if Henry did or not, but his family certainly did. And I'll say that if you get a chance to visit the Henry Ford and you get a chance to go to Greenfield Village, please do so. And I'd love to go to Ivy Green and visit Helen Keller's home. Polly Thompson's hairdresser, and Polly, by the way, was from Scotland, told her that another client of hers was looking for someone to travel about the country with her and Miss Keller on a lecture tour. That's from the Third Musketeer Perkins School for the Vine. Soon after, Thompson met with Keller and Sullivan at the New England Conservatory of Music to interview. Sullivan was impressed by Thompson's clear, deliberate, cultivated voice and attractive personality, good health, and great willingness. On November 20th, 1914, she joined the household as a secretary, eventually becoming Keller's companion and interpreter after Sullivan's death in 1936. But she was with them while Anne was still alive. Sullivan made it clear that she wanted Thompson and Keller to stay together after her death. She said that they needed each other. Anne taught Polly the manual alphabet and also how to care for Keller. Thompson was eager to learn and learned a lot. These are quotes from Anne. She quickly became a fast enough speller to keep up with Keller's expectations. She did not, however, use shortcuts. She explained, if teacher had, I would. I'd do it the way teacher did. It was a lonely beginning for Polly due to the close bond of Anne and Helen, but Polly and Keller formed a tremendous bond over the years, and they traveled all over the world and spent untold hours at home responding to letters. They settled into a mostly quiet life. They were happy to escape their respective rooms after dinner to spend the night reading their books, and that was after Anne passed. And here is Helen and Polly. And that's a Great Dane. And I the picture cut off, there's another little dog here as well. I know Helen never had a dog that was a seeing eye dog. And there's Helen and Anne in 1936. By 1936, Annie's health was in an irreversible decline. There's a slight conflict in some of the information, but most of it comes out very similar to each other. Some places say that she had completely lost her vision. Other places say that she had a limited vision in one eye by this time. Remember, she had the trachoma and she always struggled. Her one eye that had some vision had been operated on in April and began to cause her pain. She was diagnosed with gastric pains and senility. She made various trips to Canada and Eastern on Long Island, because remember, she's in New York City, Queens to be exact, now for medical treatment. None of these helped her. Finally, Annie collapsed and she was taken to a hospital in New York with coronary thrombosis, and she died 5 days later on October 20th, 1936, with Helen holding her hand. Helen described Keller as being very unsettled during her last month of life, but during the last week, she was said to return to her usual generous self. Sullivan was cremated and her ashes interred at a memorial at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. She was the first woman to be recognized for her achievements in that way. It was a great honor. She dictated messages to Polly shortly before then. Goodbye, John, Macy. I'll soon be with you. They had been separated for a long time, but apparently she was always still in love with him. Goodbye, I loved you. I wanted to be loved. I was lonesome. Then Helen came into my life. I wanted her to love me, and I loved her. Then later Polly came, and I loved her. I loved Polly, and we were always so happy together. My Polly, my Helen. Dear children, we may all meet together in harmony. My Jimmy, remember that's her brother. I'll lay these flowers by your face. Don't take him away from me. I loved him. He's all I've got. So remember, she's in and out here at the end of her life. Polly, and some people said she had lapsed into a coma, and obviously she had not if she was saying these things to Polly. Polly will take care of Helen, and as the years go on, her speeches won't be so brilliant as what people will think. My guiding hand won't be there to take out what should be taken out. I mean, Anne and Helen had a mutual dependency on each other. There were other dramatic moments over the years, but they always had that closeness. And later on, Helen and Polly will have a different type of closeness. Thank God I gave up my life that Helen might live. God help her to live without me when I go. And she was led to, she did get to spend time alone with her after she passed away. And this is Helen with Anne in later years. That makes me sad thinking about what a loss it must have been. Okay. And I must have put that in twice. Here we go. So here is a letter from Helen Keller to Clara Ford, and I only have the first page. So this is after their home had been lost in Massachusetts. They had left New York, and they're at Arkham Ridge. That was the name of their home in Westport, Connecticut. Dear Mrs. Ford, my heart is full. And this is from the Henry Ford. One senses, when the heart is full, one senses keenly the disparity between words and one's overflowing emotions. That is this feeling I had on receiving your wonderful donation to the American Foundation for Overseas Blindness. Today it's the Helen Keller Foundation. You have made us happy and grateful with evidence of your generous friendship towards me and interest in the blind through the years, and your gift at this time is a precious comfort. The difficulties of people without sight in Europe continues to be very pressing, and your hand held out to them in their heroic struggle towards renewed self-reliance gives me confidence in their final triumph. Truly, this past year has thrilled me with an amazing experiences and large contacts. And this is from the collection of the Henry Ford. Remember, Clara and Edsel donate money to this cause, and it's a cause that was very dear to Helen's heart. So remember, Helen's in a movie, and then there is, as a young woman, then there's a documentary written and directed by Nancy Hamilton. The film used those newsreel clips and photos to portray Helen's early years. Newer film footage showed her Keller during a regular day in her life, going for a walk, reading a Braille Bible. In fact, I can remember one of the books I read about Helen had her reading the 23rd Psalm in Braille, answering letters, and meeting friends for tea. 7 years later, 16-year-old Patty Duke won an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress for her portrayal of a young Helen in The Miracle Worker. And we're talking about her being like 7 years old. It's also The Miracle Worker will become a Broadway play and a movie as well. And Patty Duke was quite a bit older than the age she is portraying Helen in the movie. And one of my favorite movies, I'm sure you all recall that famous scene in The Miracle Worker where Helen realizes water is hands pumping the water onto her hand and fingers spelling in the other hand water, and she makes that connection. And yes, it's dramatic and it's a movie, but gosh, it was very meaningful and moving. And if I haven't seen The Miracle Worker, I urge you to do so. She in 1938, I forget, this is I cut things off because there's things across the top maybe that are blocking things. But in 1938, she met Eleanor Roosevelt and they remained good friends. She moved to Arkan Ridge, her home in Connecticut, where she lives for the rest of her life in 1939. And you know, I just did some things that I might not have gotten. And this is from the Perkins School for the Blind. 1943 to 1946, she visits wounded and blind veterans in military hospitals, providing support and encouragement. And there are so many pictures. I should have put some in there, tons. She reached out to them, gave them hope that they had something to live for, that they could have a life. Her work with the soul after the war and during the war is, I think, one of her greatest works. And she begins a series of world tours that takes her to 35 countries in 11 years. Her health isn't always good. She advocates on behalf of people with disabilities, inspiring many governments to establish schools for students who are blind and deaf. In 1946, she also begins touring on behalf of the American Foundation for Overseas Blind. And she returned to Japan, excuse me for a moment, in 1948, visiting over 30 cities. Her civil diplomacy on this trip is credited with improving US and Japanese relations at the end of World War II. And in 1952, she received the Gold Medal Award from the National Institute of Social Sciences for her service to humanity. 1954, the Ivy Green, the home where Helen was born, is restored and becomes a National Historic Landmark, as are we here. 1955, her book, Teacher Anne Sullivan Macy, is published. 1956, The Miracle Worker, which was a play by William Gibson, debuts on Broadway with Patty Duke as Helen Keller and Anne Bancroft as Anne Sullivan. 1960, Helen meets with President John F. Kennedy, the 10th and last United States president she met with, and she suffers from a stroke in 1961 and retires from public appearances and work. She was awarded in 1964 the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Lyndon B. Johnson. 1965, she visitors to the World's Fair elected Helen Keller to be one of 20 inductees into the National Women's Hall of Fame, tying with Eleanor Roosevelt for the most votes. 1968, Helen dies on June 1st, a few weeks before her 88th birthday at Arkan Ridge. And on June 5th, Keller's memorial service in the National Cathedral is attended by 1,200 mourners, and the choral music is performed by the choir of Perkins Institute for the Blind. And there she is with Helen Keller, and I'm going to guess this is about the time that The Miracle Worker is on Broadway. So I think that I have up there is 1961. And there she is with Patty Duke, who will play her in the movie. Helen had a stroke in 1960, and from 1961 on, she lived quietly at Arkan Ridge, her home in Westport, Connecticut, one of 4 places she lived for long amounts of time. And during her lifetime, the others were Tuscumbia, which is where you can see the National Historic Site, Wrentham, Massachusetts, and Forest Hills, New York, which was part of Queens. New York. She made her last major public appearance in 1961 at a DC Lions Club International Foundation meeting. At that meeting, she received the Lions Humanitarian Award for her lifetime of service to humanity and providing the inspiration for the adoption of the Lions Club International Foundation of their site conservation and aid to blind programs. While she was in Washington, D.C., she also met President John F. Kennedy, and there's a picture of them together. The White House, President Kennedy was just one of the many presidents Helen had met. Over a lifetime, she had met all the presidents since Grover Cleveland to Kennedy. Helen Keller died on June 1st, 1968 at her home, a few weeks short of her 88th birthday. Her ashes were interred, placed next to Anne Sullivan Macy and Polly Thompson in St. Joseph Chapel of Washington Cathedral. Before I read this last thing, I will say she and Polly traveled many places together. And the one book I read, I'd read many books growing up, but that I read said that Polly, near the end of her life, maybe she was having some dementia, I'm not quite sure, but she didn't want anybody else finger spelling in Helen's hand. I would have to dig into that deeper. So that kind of isolated them both. And Polly was having, I believe she ends up having a stroke. So some people felt like the communication wasn't always as it could have been as much for Helen during that last time when Polly wasn't in such good health herself. But she is with Helen for, I believe, 43 years, and Anne is like 46 or 47 years. And then there are two different companions that stay with Helen after she passes, after Polly passes away. And this is what, in Statuary Hall, in the capital of the United States in 2009, they had this, this statue of Helen here. And this is what it says, and I covered up some of it, but she was born, whatever, her birth date, and then at 19-month-old, and in illness, possibly scarlet fever or meningitis, left her unable to speak. From her childhood teacher and longtime companion, Anne Sullivan, this is all what it says on the statue. She learned to communicate by touch, braille, and there's also a booklet, and you can go online and find the information. So some of that is in the booklet and some is on the statue, and the use of a special typewriter. In 1890, a teacher from a Boston school for the deaf taught her to speak, but she did have lessons, but Anne had already started on that. Those, some people, as I said, some people, and I think that she came to Perkins, and some people believe that she'd been taught a different method. She could speak more clearly, but that's kind of a moot point and wasn't even necessary, though that is how she earned money on her lecture circuit. She attended the Cambridge School of Young Ladies and then entered Radcliffe College, from which she graduated in honors in 1904. Settling outside Boston, Keller and Sullivan collaborated on Helen's autobiography, The Story of My Life. Soon encouraged by Sullivan's husband, Keller embraced a variety of social causes, including women's suffrage. She lectured and wrote in support of these causes, as well as to call attention to the plight of the physically handicapped. Following World War II, she and her secretary, and I would add companion, Polly Thompson, traveled abroad to support the blind. She died on June 1st, 1968 in Westport, Connecticut. Her ashes are interred at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. Remember, her teacher, Anne Sullivan, was the first one to receive that honor. The statue depicts a moment made famous in the biographical play and movie, The Miracle Worker. It shows Helen as a 7-year-old girl wearing a pinafore over her dress. She stands at an ivy-entwined water pump. Her expression of astonishment shows the moment when she and Annie Sullivan first communicated by touch the word water. Because of Braille all around the statue base, Helen Keller's statue is the only statue in Emancipation Hall without a do not touch sign. And there it is in Braille there. And I love the statue, it's wonderful. And I mean, but I would also love to have one as an adult, because I mean, I think her accomplishments, Anne Sullivan is the one that opened the world to her. And Helen is the one that did so many wonderful things for soldiers, people with disabilities, the deafblind, the blind. So that would be my thought, because she's forever a young girl in our mind here. But I'm thankful that she's there representing the state of Alabama, of course, and Thomas Edison represents the state of Ohio. One of my favorite Keller quotes, but I should have found one. There was some light in it, but I should have found one with her head uplifted, because it says, keep your face to the sunshine and you cannot see the shadows. And I do think that Helen had a life of gratitude as well. Next month, real quick, and I'll show you my sources, Step into History, the historians that are part of the same department. I'm a manager in the digital discussion, Fordlandia, Ford's Failed Paradise, with lead historian Chase, April 5th at 10:30. What a fascinating story. Please join us. I'll be sitting here. Chase will be doing the talking. And next month, on Clara Ford's birthday, a woman that's often overlooked, but not this time, April 11th at 10:30, in honor of her birthday. I'll be doing a digital discussion on Clara Ford, the believer. You can sign up for it now. And then there's lots of things coming up. And I will look at the Q&A in just a second. Here are my sources if you want any. I read, as I said, a lot of books. I even had one by somebody she did a lot of interviews with. I think her last name was Bradley. And I had a copy of that book, and they gave it to me at the library, because that Little Women, I had taken so many times. So I can remember as a young child, real quickly, being at 4-H camp, and my mother's sending me an article about Helen Keller. She had just passed away, and that had been my dream to meet her. So I'm trying to be objective when I talk about her, but you know what it's like when somebody you greatly admire, you try to give a balanced approach. There's lots of sources out there. I would research or find out about her today. So let's look at here, question and answer. Patty Duke was one of my favorites. That's from my husband, me too, actually. And good job. Thank you for your feedback. And here, chats. Let's see. Great presentation from Sarah. Thank you. And Maxine, love the timeline. Thanks, Holly. I thank you for joining me. Come back next month. It probably won't be quite as long. I was a little verbose, I would say. But I thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you. And I will see you next month. But make sure you join us on to the Step into History digital edition as well. Thank you so much. Go visit Ivy Green. I want to get there. And I'll see you shortly.